Welcome back. We're going to dive into the words endemic, epidemic, and pandemic that we began talking about from an etymological perspective in the first half of this lecture. So endemic, again, N is in, and endemic is population or people. So endemic means in a population. So it's a disease that permanently exists in a particular region or population. So we talked a little bit about malaria. And again, malaria is a vector-borne disease. So it spreads by mosquitoes from person to person. And it is permanently in this area of Central and part of Southern Africa. And so this disease is always there all the time. It can get slightly worse in the summer months and slightly less bad in the winter months, but it is still always there. There's never a time that malaria is not in this population. So it doesn't mean that the same people have it all the time, but it exists within that population. So this is the high area, the yellow is moderate, and the blue is low. So it is arguably endemic to these areas. And so it's not endemic to, for instance, these parts of the world in white. So endemic in population. So again, epidemic means on a population. So it's the rapid spread of an infectious disease to a large number of people within a short period of time. So it occurs at a higher than normal rate. So something can be both an epidemic and endemic. So say there is always a certain level of disease, of malaria in, say, Mali, but there is a particular spike in those cases. So there's more than normal. That can still be an epidemic. This example is of Ebola in Western Africa. So it's in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and this happened roughly 2014 to 2016. So we can also think of epidemics as having a particular start date. They happen, so we can also think about epidemics in terms of a cold in a classroom, right? So you have one person who gets it, and then it quickly spreads to a large number of people in a short period of time. So large number of people is a little subjective here, but we can think of a specific start and a specific spread. So the entire study of infectious disease is epidemiology. They can also be restricted to one location. So this epidemic was really restricted to these three countries primarily. And if you're interested in looking at a map tracing the spread of this disease, you can look at this great hyperlink that goes to the website and looks at how Ebola moved throughout these three countries. So again, epi, on, demic, population, upon the population at a specific period of time. The final kind of disease spreading that we're going to talk about is a pandemic. And again, pan means all, or every, and demic means people. And so this applies to all people. So at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about the 1918 flu epidemic. It's called Spanish influenza. It started in Spain. But as you can see at this map, it affected the entire world, including the Gulf and the United States, as we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. It killed roughly 30% of the world's population. So it is an epidemic, right? It began in a particular place. In ways it is endemic. Flu occurs, it is kind of always in the world, and it was a pandemic because it was a worldwide spread of disease. So it happened at a specific time, and spread to all populations of the world. Something doesn't have to spread to literally every single person in the world to be a pandemic, but it does have to occur across multiple populations. And given how the world has shifted and how much trade there is and how many people move across the world, pandemics are becoming more and more common. So if we can think about the coronavirus, that is hopefully still relevant when you guys watch this. It is going pandemic now, right? It's being spread across multiple populations. But it's important to note that just the classification doesn't actually tell us much. So it doesn't tell us, for instance, what the death rate is. So, for instance, now the flu can still be pandemic, but the death rate from the flu is like 0.2%. So it's not necessarily very concerning. We can also look at, for instance, how many people are infected per person who has it. So to think about that a little bit, we're going to look at some epidemiological modeling. So just to think quickly about this. So say this one person starts off, say, having the flu. And so say that on average, every person who has the flu spreads to 2 different people. And so they spread to these 2 people, and this person spreads to these 2 people, and this person spreads to these 2 people, and on and on and on. So we're going to talk a little bit, this is not entirely accurate, but it's an easy way to think about it. There's some major assumptions that are being made. But very quickly, you've gone from 1 person infected to 16 people infected, to 32 people infected, and so on. So this model is y2 to the x. It's an exponential curve that you see here. And let's talk about some of the assumptions for that. So we're assuming that the population is an enclosed area, so no one's coming in or out. You have no immigration or emigration, people coming in or out. The total population is fixed, so you don't have you don't see people dying quicker than they're being born, or being born quicker than they're dying. It's transmitted by direct individual contact. So this model really doesn't hold up when you would think about, for instance, a disease that's airborne, that's in direct contact, or that moves through like an environmental reservoir. So it wouldn't work for something like cholera. And you also don't consider recovered people, because often recovered people are, they may be immune to the disease because their adaptive immune system have already seen that pathogen, so it recognizes that they're less likely to get sick. And so in this, we're assuming that everybody can get sick. We're also not assuming that anybody's been vaccinated. We're going to talk a little bit more about vaccination in just a minute. So even though there are these assumptions for epidemic modeling, it's important to think about how quickly diseases can spread, and what that can look like. So we're not going to talk anything more about this, but I wanted to give a little bit of a thought about how the math might come into this. So how do we treat epidemics when they happen? First, we have antibiotics and antivirals. So antibiotics target bacteria, and antivirals target viruses. We talked about these as two of the major classifications of pathogens. So antibiotics and antivirals treat these people when they actually happen, and also can keep the disease from spreading. We look at data on victims, so we can think about, for instance, who might be most at risk. So, for instance, about the coronavirus, we know that people who are in hospitals are particularly at risk. This is similar to diseases before it, like SARS. But by knowing that, we can heighten precautions, particularly in hospitals where there are affected patients. Quarantine is the practice of taking people who may have been exposed to the pathogen and putting them in isolation where they're not with any other people. So this is different than isolation, which is taking someone who has the disease and not letting them to be exposed to any other people. So quarantine is anybody who may have been exposed. They may or may not be showing symptoms. So, for instance, thinking about anybody coming from a specific place on a plane may have to spend 14 days in an airport or 14 days in a hotel that is specifically for quarantine people. Governmental declarations, so declaring states of emergency can unlock types of funding. Education, making sure people, for instance, know to wash their hands, know how to interact with family members who might have this disease, and also vaccination, which we're going to talk about at more length. So vaccination is the practice of exposing someone to a safe version of disease. By doing so, the adaptive immune system learns how to respond to the disease if you were to be exposed naturally. So the safe version of a disease that we're talking about here could be a protein that the disease produces. It could be an inactive form of the disease. There are a variety of ways, but it's a safe version of that disease. But since it is a safe version of that disease, they might present with mild symptoms. So, for instance, they may run a slight fever, their temperature may go up, they may have chills or muscle aches or a reaction at the injection site, but this doesn't mean that it's not working. It means that the immune system is responding to that foreign invader. And the adaptive immune system then takes over and is able to identify, yes, we've seen, for instance, here hepatitis B before, and we'll be able to fight it off when they see it in the wild. So vaccination is really effective. So this is the number of smallpox cases in the world from 1920 to 2010. If you see at different points, smallpox was affecting probably conservative estimates, but still over 600,000 people per year. But we developed a smallpox vaccination and vaccinated a great percentage of the world's population, and in doing so, actually eradicated smallpox in 1976. Smallpox doesn't exist natively in any part of the world now, even though it was killing hundreds of thousands of people per year. And it now exists only in laboratories. So, but it's important to note that this only works if there's herd immunity. So herd immunity is the idea that everyone needs to be vaccinated, who can possibly be vaccinated, in order to protect everyone else. So on the left, we have a picture of nobody being vaccinated. So the blue is if nobody's vaccinated, and see quickly how the red, the disease spreads. In here we have yellow, so we have some vaccinated people, 25% vaccinated. And you see slower spread, but still pretty quick. Quickly finds the people who haven't been vaccinated. 50% is slower, 75% is slower, as you'd imagine. By 90%, it begins to be very, very slow, the spread of disease, and 95%, it's almost a non-existent spread of disease because it's so difficult to find people who are not vaccinated. This is also really important because there are some people who cannot be vaccinated. So if you think about people who are immunocompromised, for instance, even though it's a safe version of a vaccine, they may still have a hard time, their bodies may have a hard time dealing with that. So for instance, people who are on chemotherapy for cancer, they may not be able to fight off that infection. So they would actually get, for instance, measles, even though they wouldn't normally. So most people who get that vaccine aren't going to get measles, but if you are immunocompromised, you might. It's an opportunistic infection in that case. So it's really critical, because in reality, we're never going to be able to vaccinate everyone. You're still going to have these blue dots, and so it's still possible that the vaccine will be spread. But it's critical that anybody who could possibly be vaccinated is vaccinated, in order to prevent this spread. So how do we prevent epidemics? We can prevent epidemics a lot of the same ways that we treat them when they happen. And really a lot of it comes down to things that seem really basic, like hand washing, and preventing the spread of germs between people, and other places that pathogens like to hang out. Vaccination is also a critical component of preventing epidemics. So it may seem big and scary at this time, but there really are very actionable items that we can do. So next week we're going to begin talking about other forms of diseases, and excited to see you then.